The Great Depression began with the stock market crash of 1929, and for the next 10 years, America suffered through the worst economic crisis in our history. Millions of people lost their jobs, and rather than starve or sit idle, many of them took to the road. Those who went by rail were called hobos. Hoboing didn't start in the Depression. After the Civil War, Confederate soldiers, most of them farmers, returned home to ruin crops and burned homes. Out of work, these men tied a few possessions to their hoes and went west, hopping freight trains in search of farm work. They became known as Ho Boys or hobos.
Actually, hoboing had declined shortly before the First World War and the end of the 19th century. It was going down. And when the Great Depression occurred, beginning in the early 30s and on up until the Second World War, late 20s, hoboing actually increased again. As a matter of fact, I've seen some figures. People estimated there were 60,000 hobos roughly at the turn of the century. By the time you get to the 1930s and the Depression, they're considered 2 or 3 million who at one time or the other were riding the rails, of course because of the economic conditions. They couldn't get jobs.
With a fourth of the population out of work during the Depression and no welfare system to help people out, 34 million men, women, and children had no income to live on. Slums cropped up everywhere. The poor moved into cardboard houses and garbage dumps, only to be evicted again. In Georgia, the unemployed were sometimes arrested and forced to work on chain gangs. Often the only solution was to keep moving, and many Southerners joined the wandering population, hoping to find work in the next town. Some became hobos.
Guess you have another birthday.
Well, nothing.
Horace Hampton, a retired steelworker, married and the father of 5, was a hobo in the 1930s, and he remembers how many people were out of work.
I would say millions and millions during the Depression. People out of work, you know, and factories closing and other plants closing and businesses going out of business, and it was terrible. I mean, most of the people you saw on the road would be people that's out looking for work.
This scene from the movie Sullivan's Travels shows dozens of men scrambling to hop a freight. It may seem exaggerated, but it shows how it really was.
Jump!
Amateurs.
And most of them, I guess, would qualify for the term that we use today, migrant workers, in the sense that they would go from, say, hoeing potatoes at the potato harvest in Maine, then they'd catch trains and go out to Idaho and harvest the potatoes at a different time of year and so forth. And so they would follow the crops, and we would really call many of them, I guess, today, migratory farm workers who use the trains as a mode of transportation.
People sometimes confuse hobos with bums, but those who remember the Depression say there was a big difference.
But among themselves, they're very adamant about the difference. And someone will tell you, one of the old-time hobos from the 30s or the 20s will say, "No, I was a hobo. I was not a tramp. I was not a bum." I mean, they make a very big thing about the definition.
Well, a hobo is more or less an itinerant worker, and a bum, he won't work.
Life for hobos wasn't easy. They slept outside year-round in camps called jungles. Often jungles became a refuge, not just for hobos, but whole families, which meant even more mouths to feed. In this scene from the movie Fried Green Tomatoes, these 2 women throw food from a freight car to feed the hungry. Life in the jungle was hard enough, but riding the rails was lonely, cold, and extremely dangerous.
A gimpy stiff was one who had lost a leg. Very frequent among the hobos to lose bits and pieces of feet and legs, because jumping on and off the railroad cars was extremely dangerous, and if you got your legs caught under one and you fell, obviously the wheel and the flange riding on the rail would just simply amputate your leg immediately. So there were lots of gimpy stiffs.
Today, the construction of trains and railroad security makes it virtually impossible to ride the trains. People also have more alternatives in times of need. But in the Great Depression, just about everybody was suffering.
In the old days, partly, I suppose, the hobos were given a fairly easy reception on a railroad's property simply because maybe some of the train crew themselves had hoboed. So they had a certain sympathy for people who were down on their luck, who were traveling on the trains.
Times were so hard, no one knew when they'd be out of work next. So people were usually generous toward hobos, sometimes giving them a little work or food or a free cup of coffee.
No, it's on the house.
Thank you. Much obliged to you.
Many times after getting a meal at a home, they would leave and put one of their signs or marks on a fence or perhaps a postal box on the street. And those often indicated the kind of reception that they had gotten. And then the next hobo who came along could read that.
Hobos use symbols like these to tell each other where to get medical help, where to find food, or where to find a safe place to spend the night. Hobos also left personalized artwork on the side of boxcars, and they almost always went by nicknames like Boso Texino, Baldwin Boot, Buckeye Kid, or The Dog.
They wanted an identity, but they didn't want to give their real identity. And I think that was probably part of it. They didn't want people to think that they were down on their luck or that they had to search for jobs and so on.
World War II helped to end the Depression. It brought economic stability and jobs back to the nation. Hobos who were healthy and young enough joined the military. Others got jobs and settled down. The Depression hobos have disappeared from the freight cars, and with them, a tradition unique to the United States. After all, America was settled by people looking for something better, and hoboing reflects the wanderlust in our national character. And for anyone who has ever hoboed, sometimes the lone whistle of the iron road still calls them.
In 1932, the average weekly wages of those who had jobs was $16.21.
About Georgia's economic history, there are more stories to tell, so we'll be back. This is Georgia Stories 2. I'm Colin Sedor. Thanks.